I'm Katie Shilton. I'm an assistant professor here at the iSchool at the University of Maryland. And I'm going to be talking today about participatory data, data that people collect about themselves using mobile technologies. But before I start that, Mark had asked us each to give just a little spiel about how we got here. And I got here through sort of an odd path. I trained as an archivist. I thought I wanted to be an archivist. And so I went to library school. And I was really interested in archives because I'm really interested in who gets to make decisions about our historical record, right? So who gets to make decisions about what's in the archive? And that was a really interesting question. But when I got to library school, I realized that question is changing a lot right now. There's a lot of content out in the world that didn't used to exist. There's a lot of participatory media, participatory content, which is really, really cool. And the archivist in me sort of said, great, now we'll have a complete historical record, which is not true, right? We all know that's not true. But there are all these things that push back against that as well, right? When we start to record everything, do we really want to keep all of that around? And I got really interested in those questions. And it was less about archives now and more about people's interaction with technology and their practices and why do they record this data and, whoa, the technology affordances, what do they allow, what do they not allow, how much of this stuff is going to be kept and how much of that is built into the infrastructure. And so I say this to sort of demonstrate that as you're on this PhD path, things shift, they change. And there are sort of new areas opening up for those of us who thought we were really traditionalists and wanted to do this really old-fashioned thing. So that's how I got sort of here. That's why I care about this kind of participatory data. I'm interested in it as a record, but also in the social values that go into both its practice in recording it and also the design that enables it. And so I'm going to talk today about what this data is, this participatory data I'm talking about. What its relationship is to technologically mediated social participation, and some of the challenges and concerns that it raises. So participation with data. What is this data? I'm broadly interested in emergent types of personal data, as well as the new data collection practices and technologies that go along with this data practice. So this could be familiar tools like Facebook and Twitter. We're all creating records about ourselves all the time. We know that the Library of Congress is going to archive Twitter posts, things like that. So there's new kinds of records about ourselves. But the ones that I've been looking at are data applications that are being built for mobile phone networks. So I'm really interested in the data we collect about ourselves or the data others collect about us using our mobile phones. And the reason I'm interested in mobile phones is that they are one of the most pervasive digital technology in the world. They have billions of users all over the world. They're quite familiar and accessible, and they ride along with us, right? We take them where we go. And even the simplest phones, non-smartphones, can record text data and upload it or send it via SMS. They also, all cell phones record or can record location data. Now, smartphones can do that with GPS, but a non-smartphone is using cell towers to locate itself, and your phone company has a record of that, right? So location data is built into all of this. And then smartphones can record photos, videos, increasingly accelerometer data, so how much you're moving. And this kind of data can be used for all kinds of cool new sorts of data tracking. So participatory research, by one person if you want to record data about yourself, or by thousands of people, potentially. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of what you might do with this data. So these examples are for context. These are from two projects that I worked with during my dissertation research, and I'll talk a little bit more about the center that ran that. But these are to give you an example of what this data might do. The first is the Boyle Heights Community Development Project, and this was a development project run in a mixed income neighborhood in Los Angeles, in East LA. And it was initiated by a coalition of community groups that wanted to do a community needs assessment. So they were going to develop a redevelopment plan, and they wanted to get a feeling for the neighborhood and what people do on a daily basis in that neighborhood. So the community organizations recruited a bunch of volunteers who ran specialized software on their mobile phone. And that software popped up location-based surveys. So as people went about their day, it would pop up a survey when they passed the local park or the grocery store or the hospital or the school and ask them about their use of that space, whether they felt safe there, whether there was access to fresh foods, or whether they liked their school, all kinds of questions like that, all based on location. So what you're seeing here are a very simple data entry screen, and then a map of one of the users, right? So in order to do this, it records where you go all the time. A really different example is a class of individual health monitoring tools that are emerging under the name mobile health or mHealth. And this is an umbrella of software applications, both commercial and research-based, that help people track personal metrics about their own health. So samples, generally this involves running software on your phone again, and it can initiate, that software will initiate samples. And these are called experiences of daily living sometimes, or observations of daily living, or experience samples. And the idea is your phone knows, again, where you are and can pop up questions for you throughout the day. So what's your mood? What's your stress level? How are you feeling? And it can geotag those. It might pop up reminders at mealtime, for instance. If you go into a restaurant, it might say, oh, what did you have to eat, right? Or it might ask you to input who you're with and who you're talking to sort of get the idea around sociality and eating. It might use the alarm on your phone to understand when you woke up and pop up a question about your sleep quality, right? So you could track a whole variety of things using these mobile health technologies. And so you might collect your GPS location trace, your text data, images of food of the people you eat with, and then you might share that, right, with a coach or a clinician, a researcher perhaps, friends, a variety of people you might share that data with. Yeah.
And access to that by partnering with Open mHealth?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So
the users downloaded the application, you had access to all of them.
I didn't have access to users' data. The user themselves has access to this data. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about where this data goes and who has access to it, because this is actually a critical question. So, and I think as your concern suggests and as these examples suggest, participatory data applications have some pretty useful applications going forward, but they also collect extremely sensitive information. And we got a recent white paper that the group I was working with put out, got a response from somebody at the EPA. And she posted on a listserv and posted, participatory sensing is either terrifying or electrifying, depending on who does it and how the information are processed. And she's right? There are two big ifs in participatory sensing. Who is collecting this data? Is it somebody you trust? Is it the government? Is it advertisers? Is it your health insurance company? University researchers? Maybe we trust them, right? And how is it processed? What can be inferred from this kind of data? So the question I became really concerned with was what differentiates participation in data collection, collecting data about yourself and your community perhaps, and surveillance. Like, what is the difference between these two things? When does recording data about yourself and your community shift from social participation to surveillance? And I'm going to suggest that there are at least 4 conditions. There are probably more, but there are at least 4 that we need to think hard about. And these come out of the surveillance studies lit, primarily, that distinguish participatory data collection from surveillance. The first is the ability to make decisions about when and how to collect the data. So this is about consent. Do individuals know that they're participating in these projects? Do they forget that that software is running on their phone? Do they know what it means to collect this kind of data? And so there's a real challenge here. What does informed consent, a tradition we have in social research, mean when these devices are so close to our everyday lives and so easy to forget about? A second condition is having access to our own data and controlling its flow. So this is what Jessica was talking about earlier in terms of privacy, right? This is a classic privacy concern. Who can see data when, and how much can participants hide? And Jessica was talking about interpersonal privacy, which is certainly important here. You wouldn't want to give your health information to your boss. But I'm also talking about broader surveillance concerns around privacy, right? You wouldn't want to give that health information to your insurance company necessarily, or to the government. So how much can participants hide? Can they lie? Can they fudge data? These are all questions. So a third concern that differentiates surveillance and participatory data collection is preventing people with power over you, so that is corporations, law enforcement, from using your data against you. So this is about power and equity. Collecting information about people is a primary source of power in an information economy. So who benefits from this kind of data collection? And will this data be used in hiring decisions or insurance decisions or even product pricing decisions? We're seeing lots more of that. And then a fourth concern is being able to wipe your slate clean, right? If you collect data about your health for a month, does that data always need to be around about you? Should that be there forever? Should it always be accessible? Do we need total accountability or memory or, for our actions and routines? So this is a question about forgetting. Is this something we should be able to do? So there's no question that continuously recording your location activities in particular and health behaviors, all of those kinds of things can be pretty invasive. And I want to point out now that there are few or no laws in the United States of protecting this kind of data. And I'll talk a little bit more about the policy implications later. But right now, this data is completely unprotected legally. So it becomes a question of social values. What moral and human values are important here? And the conditions I named, privacy, equity, consent, forgetting, are all values that can guide design of these technologies. If there are no laws protecting this data, perhaps we should design protections in to the technologies we are building, to the software. And there's a larger movement right now, what's been going on for 20 years, of people that are trying to figure out what values are built into our technologies or should be built into our technologies. This is broadly called values in design or value-sensitive design. And my dissertation is part of this larger trajectory, trying to figure out these questions of values within technology. And so these social and ethical challenges, particularly raised by this kind of data, led me to want to know, how do these challenges affect technology development? Are technologists talking about these challenges as part of their practice? And what makes social values a part of their discussion? So my dissertation project was an ethnographic study of social values within a design process at the Center for Embedded Networked Sensing, which is a mouthful, CENS. And CENS was a large computer science center. It was devoted to developing sensor networks. And they had, in the years I was there, moved towards developing mobile phone-based sensor networks to sense people. So they were actively developing software to collect this kind of data. And both the Boyle Heights project and mHealth come out of that center. And so I spent 2 years as a participant observer in that lab. I went to meetings, I hung out, I did my work in the lab, and I have to say it was a participant observation with a real emphasis on participant. I was a member of the team, I participated in meetings, I was vocal and active, and that's actually me with much shorter hair, it confuses everyone, participating in the lab, right? And these are what meetings look like. There were lots of whiteboards, a beautiful building. This is sort of CENS as ethnographic object. I collected lots of field notes. I did interviews with all 30 or so staff members. There were a mix of faculty, staff, full-time staff, and students who worked there. And I also did document analysis. I looked at all of the things they were writing, their justifications, their sort of the entirety of their design process. And I began my process by getting oriented to sense design. I wanted to figure out, okay, what are their existing design practices? How do they work? And the answer to that was meetings. It was a very team-driven place. They had at least one full group meeting a week. They had multiple small meetings and then ad hoc meetings throughout the week. So that is great for an ethnographer because you can see people justifying their decisions because they have to communicate them to each other. Much harder to do ethnography and software design when they do it by themselves because you have to look over their shoulder at the code. Much harder. This was a good situation for studying design. So I was watching them hash out their problems. And what I was looking for were activities that encourage designers to pay attention to and talk about and design for privacy, consent, equity, and forgetting. What made those topics appear? And when I found activities that caused these values topics to appear, I called those values levers because they pry open new conversations about social concerns, and they help the designers build consensus around those concerns as part of their work practice, as something that's important to design for. And so I started looking for values levers in design and noticed their position within design. I noticed that some of these activities I started to see were inherent to design. They were already there, they were part of the design setting, while others came from outside influences. I'll talk about sort of both kinds in detail. So there were many levers that were already part of design at Sense. They were inherent to the setting. And my first sort of aha moment when I saw this happening, when I saw what this was in meetings with statisticians. There were some statisticians, the team was primarily composed of computer scientists, but there were some statisticians who were members of the team as well because they were dealing with a lot of data and they needed to figure out how to represent it. And in these meetings with statisticians, everybody would have to talk about the data because the data was what statisticians care about. So they would talk about representation, and yes, they would have mathematical discussions, but they would also talk about the sort of ethics of how to represent that data and what that data says and what you could infer from it. And that conversation about the data was really important for getting computer scientists to sort of pay attention to the values issues. So they were really embedded in that data. The pipes, yeah, harder to see the values issues. The data, easy to see the values issues. And so I noticed this not just with statisticians after that, but any interdisciplinary folks who came into the lab, an urban planner, a sociologist, everybody had to talk about the data. That was the lingua franca of design, right? That was the piece that everybody could talk about. And so that became a really important values lever, bringing interdisciplinary folks in and forcing everyone to talk about the data. Another lever that was related to data was gaining funding. And this was sort of an interesting thing to watch. As a project got a grant, the funding team, or the design team would grow. They would add a full-time programmer who would actually build the code, which was a huge relief to the grad students who didn't want to write that code, right? And so as they added people, they were forced to talk about the data much more as they had to communicate across different people about what they wanted to design. So I started to see more and more values discussions as teams got bigger and had more people worried about the data. And then a final lever I'm going to talk about, which was really interesting, was experiencing internal testing. When developers tracked themselves, they got the values issues right away, right? So a common practice at Sens was internal pilots. This is just good design practice. They call it eating your own dog food, right? And it's meant to test for bugs and usability. This was not a specific values-based activity. This was to make sure that the server could handle the load, right? And that there weren't any bugs in the code. But in my interviews, I started to notice a hesitation to test sleep or food studies that we were running when they knew their peers would be looking at that data. And so the laboratory test, pilot test, became a values lever. So you started seeing quotes like, if I'm going somewhere and I don't want anyone to know, I think, I need to turn off this application or leave my cell phone. Or another grad student, I did data collection for T, another grad student, for like a week or something. Then I felt like, not privacy, but I felt that I wanted to go out more actively. I felt like, oh, they're watching me. I need to be more active. Right, so you started to see a lot of this kind of contemplation and reflection about, oh, yeah, right, this is what users will experience. So self-testing, like interdisciplinary teams, fostered a focus on the data. And the kinds of data under request made surveillance and privacy concerns really concrete for the designers. There are also a number of introduced values levers in this space. These were not accidental. These were things, interventions by outside people that brought values into the design discussion. So user feedback was a really interesting one of these. Sens leaders made a very explicit decision to do user-centered design, to involve users in the design process to get feedback. And when users had concerns about things like privacy and consent, it did carry a lot of weight in design. People really listened to it. So I saw this with the grad students and postdocs who are working on medical studies or on health studies. Users had a lot of privacy concerns, and they would take that very seriously. The problem is that user privacy concerns are not consistent across all domains. They're contextual, right? So we have a lot of privacy concerns in the health space, many fewer in the campus trash collection space. And there was a campus trash collection app that was about recycling and trash, and the users in that study said, oh yeah, no, we don't care about privacy. Privacy doesn't matter. And the designers heard privacy doesn't matter to users, not privacy doesn't matter in this context, right? So user feedback was a very difficult lever to interpret and was very sort of sensitive. So I think it was a little less effective than it could have been. More effective levers included mandates imposed by UCLA's IRB, and we sort of all hate to hear this because we all complain about it, but these students were working with the IRB for the first time, for the most part. Computer scientists historically have not had to get their projects approved by the IRB, and it was a really interesting values lever for them to have to fill out the paperwork and to decide about what consent looked like in this space, and to realize that their institution took it seriously. And finally, there was a lot of values advocacy, and this is unique to this space, but it's interesting to think about, I think, as we think about shaping labs going forward. Leader advocacy. The leaders, there were 3 PIs in this space, and they took values very seriously and continually advocated for it, and they sort of helped to normalize these conversations at SENS. So the 3 major leaders, the 3 PIs, essentially, they were all faculty, pretty senior folks, took privacy, consent, equity, and forgetting very seriously. And they would raise these concerns during meetings and when reviewing what projects would go forward. You know, they had a lot of power in terms of deciding what projects went forward, and privacy and consent concerns became part of that. But they also set lab procedures, and I think this is really important. Again, this sounds really boring, paperwork, and nobody likes it. But it does do important work in design. They mandated an online form before you even had to apply to the IRB. There was a pretty simple checklist where you said what kind of data you were collecting. And at one point I had that on the slide, but it's gone now. What kind of data you were collecting, who from, were there special populations, kids involved, all those kinds of things. And it sort of forced the students to think through, okay, right, yeah, I'm collecting data from kids. Maybe some concerns here. So, and it really emphasized that these values were going to be taken seriously by the lab. It also helped those of us who were concerned with values look out for potential conflicts, so we could talk to students directly if we saw conflicts arising. Okay, so as I analyzed my field notes from this 3 years in the lab, I began to see a process of moving from relatively abstract social values, those concerns I brought up at the beginning, privacy and consent and equity, pretty abstract, to design decisions. And it's a complex process to go from an abstract value to a technology design, right? And so at SENS, I noticed that this proceeded in roughly 3 phases, so mapping these values into design. First was agreeing on values of importance. So that was the values lever part of this, right? Values levers helped the team come to consensus that, oh yeah, privacy is something we should care about. Consent and equity are things we should care about. Then we had to operationalize those values as design principles. Design principles are targeted, concrete goals for a system. So it's very easy to say, yes, we care about privacy, but as Jessica demonstrated, a lot harder to build privacy features, right? What does that mean? What is privacy in this system? So we would come up with things like, okay, local control of the data. The user should be able to have the first point of control over their data. They should own their data and be able to make decisions with it. And legibility, we should make UIs so that people understand what this data says about them, right? Or long-term engagement. People's needs are going to change over time. Let's keep them engaged with the system so they can continue to make decisions about sharing over time. Or parsimony, this was an important one. Let's record the least amount of data we need to answer whatever the question is we're trying to get at. Let's not record everything, right? Let's be parsimonious. So that was something we could operationalize. And then finally, you have to move from those design features to tech features and affordances, to the things you build into the system. So that was, thinking about the architecture and how local control is reflected in the very architecture of the system, or the UI design, or other affordances like filters. How are we going to build good filters so that people can share subsets of their data? Or data retention procedures. That turned out to be really hard to do, right? We have back up all our systems. Data retention is tricky and involves a lot of making sure you've actually deleted what you said you've deleted. So some solutions that we came up with in this space that came out of these discussions about values. So the values levers made this discussion about values part of design, and then translating those values into principles and features created some solutions for this space. And these are sort of partial, but we're getting there, which is exciting. One example solution that came out of these values discussions was what we call the personal data vault. And the personal data vault is a secure cloud repository for all of your data that comes off of your phone. And we sort of thought about it like a bank account for your data. It's the place you go where you can see it all, you can see what it says about you. You have some nice visualization features. And then from there, you can make sharing decisions. You can send subsets of that data out to third parties, right? And this is an idea that's popping up in several places, like any good idea. It wasn't just ours, right? There have been some prototypes built at Stanford and AT&T Labs, as well as at SENS. And excitingly for us, there's starting to be commercial products emerging. There's a startup here in DC called Personal.com, which is building a data vault and has an interesting model to fund it. So it's starting to be a way of, I think we're starting to think about controlling our personal data in unique ways. This might be one. So a values-based design process can inspire technical creativity, and that's great, and we need that. There's a lot more to be done in this space. But we're going to need more than just technical solutions to make sure we can collect personal data in a participatory and not surveillant way. So there's a need for new legislation to protect some of this personal data that's flowing through this mobile ecosystem right now. The data collected by mobile apps is currently, as I mentioned, not protected under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. It's not protected under HIPAA, even if it's medical data, because you generate it, not your medical provider. And so none of this has any legal protections. So for instance, if data vaults are going to be part of the solution, we're probably going to need to protect the data in the data vault. Otherwise, as Mark mentioned earlier, you've got a real honeypot, right? You've got everybody's personal data in one place. That is ripe for subpoena, and it will be subpoenaed, absolutely. And so protecting some of this data, perhaps needing a warrant to access personal data would be a good standard as we start to think about how to encourage this. And I want to point out that there is precedent for protective laws that are to encourage participation. In the genomics and genetics space, we have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, which was precisely designed to protect people who wanted to participate in genomics projects by giving their genomic data from discrimination by employers or insurance companies. So if you make your data public or give it to people, you can't be fired or denied insurance based on your genetic information. Perhaps we need something like this with this personal data if we think of this as a footprint of our lives, right? And the Federal Trade Commission is currently starting a multi-stakeholder dialogue about best practices and privacy for mobile applications. It's a pretty unregulated space. It will be interesting to see what comes out of that, and I will be watching that closely. Okay, so both of these issues, technology solutions, policy solutions, emphasize the need to understand an entire data ecosystem. There are dozens of players in this space. My dissertation was about just one research lab, but there are startups, research labs, telecoms are a player in this space because they have all of this data as well. It all passes through their network, right? So they have it as well. And then regulators. Oh, and users, right? What are users doing? What are their practices around this data? So I'm beginning a second study, a new study, of startups and telecommunications companies and federal regulators and users, and specifically going to use interviews and participant observation to focus on privacy challenges and decision-making among these groups, and specifically places where creativity comes into the process, where privacy can inspire. I think, we hear a lot about privacy tamping down on innovation, but it also can inspire, values can inspire innovation in interesting ways as well. So I want to look for both of those things in this ecosystem and see where this is occurring and why. I'm also working on studies of users. We don't know a lot about, and I was just talking to somebody earlier today, we don't know a lot about the motivations for people for collecting this data, how long they do it, why and why not, all of these things. So I'm working with my colleague Beth St. Jean, who's here, and Brian Butler on a study of self-quantifiers who are sort of enthusiasts in this space, and their motivations and practices around this data. And also conducting a survey with another colleague of privacy concerns in context in this space. So what are people's concerns and their values really in this particular context? But lots more is needed. So if folks are interested in this general area, there's a ton of research to be done in this space. So for researchers of the socio-technical, right? For those interested in technologically mediated social participation, there are a lot of big questions here at the intersection of technological trajectories mobile data collection is a new and emerging phenomenon, and where it intersects with social challenges is a really important question. So thinking about values and ethics and justice in this space. And there's a lot of room to investigate and understand how these technologies affect users as well as institutions, and how we can best design technologies to reflect fairness and social justice. That, if we want to do this, how do we do this right, essentially? And I want to close with the idea that researchers in this space can be part of design. That we bring understandings built on professional ethics from some of our fields, research ethics from many of our fields, and studies of justice, right? And that's, surveillance studies is really all about that. So we can bring those traditions as a skill set for design, that operationalizing social values can be a skill set for design. So I'm going to leave it here, take questions from you guys, leave you with a great technology ethics comic. It's true. Read the comic, and then you can ask about the comic.
So I'm wondering, when you talk about values, whose values are these? I mean, are there any cultural differences? Because a lot of values are shaped by cultures. Are we just talking US or?
Yes, really good question. So, and this gets at this question of values versus ethics, and which of those. So, value-sensitive design really struggles with this question because values are contextual and specifically cultural. And so my study was very much US based. It's in a US policy context and a US design context, but the challenge is this design is for everyone, right? These things are being designed for everyone. At least the vision of the designers is that this could be used around the world. And so there's a real challenge about how to do value-sensitive design when the context is supposedly everyone, because we know that privacy, for instance, is very different cross-culturally. I think things like equity and consent perhaps are more universal, but we see challenges there as well. So I don't have a good answer except for that we need a lot of comparative work, and we need. But I think in terms of trying to design for everyone or global vision for design, we have a huge challenge there. That I don't have a good solution for.
Do you know if there are other countries who are working on similar stuff?
Yes. And again, value-sensitive design, for whatever reason, has tended to be a very US phenomenon. But we're sort of starting to see, for instance, it comes out of the participatory design movement, which is much more global and has many more case studies in a variety of places around the world. And so I think we're just starting to see value-sensitive design or values in design also take on case studies elsewhere in the world. But yeah, I think let's encourage this phenomenon. This is work that really needs to be done. Amalia.
How do you, when you look into value-sensitive design, how does that fit with national security issues? For example, if you want to discuss, private data and this and the other, and you want to apply that in design, how do you deal with the government?
Right. Aha. So you have just identified something which I glossed right over, which are values conflicts. How do we design for conflicting values, right? You tend to see essentially designers taking a stance, realizing at some point that their design practice is political, and saying, very explicitly, actually, you see this all the time, the police should not have this data, right? So that's a value statement right there. And because of, so something I'm sort of working on now is, where are these values coming from in the design community? And there are historical trajectories here, right? Design practice has tended to be libertarian in politics. Now, that's not always true, and there are definitely collectivist impulses and values within design, and it's, of course, not a uniform space, but there are particular political conversations that happen in these settings. They tend to be rather anti-surveillance in the United States, and that's just sort of a history of this community. And so, in terms of, do I have an opinion about weighing national security versus participation? Yeah, I come out of surveillance studies, so I have a political stance that we should push back against surveillance always, even at the expense of security. But that's me, right? I don't get to make that design decision for everybody. So I think that this is a tension we're going to continue to see as we see computer science values butting up against government values, butting up against user values. And I think the best that I can say is, well, let's consult the users on that one, right? That if we think about national security as an interest of the population, but also being able to record our own data without fear of surveillance as an interest of the population, let's get users to weigh those two and decide which one they want. That way I don't have to make the decision. Cop out.
So something that I thought this was fascinating because I also sometimes talk with the designers and the way they do and don't explicitly think about the values and how it comes out. So very interesting work. Now, I'm for asking and talking with users. I think that's a great first step. And I have some survey data asking college students because that's the audience. But I think it's a good audience to ask these questions because they are usually a little better. So it's a better case scenario. And their imagination on what could be done with this data is quite limited. Right? And I don't really blame people. It's hard to foresee how this aggregation of data and its intersections, it's just not something, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which they're aggregated and intersect that you don't really expect someone to be able to conceptualize. So if I ask them, who do you think looks at this and who do you think might ever use this data? At most, they're thinking of their peers most of the time because that's the socially salient thing, the kind of future issues. It's just not on their radar. Which brings me to, it's like a tragedy of commons situations because while the users can't be expected to fully grasp the consequences of a very complex system that designers don't have any clue either. So there's nobody here, maybe except kind of like academics and a few pundits, who are thinking the big picture,
sort of what ifs and
this whole big complex thing. So I'm for asking the users. I'm just saying even that's going to hit a wall because people are going about their everyday lives, their salience as their peers, and the data is so big and complex increasingly. I mean, this is not an academic question. This is like
but it's a good, practical. I mean, on my bad days, I say, well, there's going to have to be a disaster of some sort, right? And then everybody will pay attention. But I hate that answer, right? I hope that doesn't have to happen, that we don't have to have some massive breach of, I don't know what it would be, because we don't quite know what the harms are here, right? But I think to get to the question of users and their sort of knowledge of the possibilities, I started to see, and I need to do more research to substantiate this, but that there are differences in people's imaginations about what could happen, defined along lines of privilege. So the graduate students I worked with didn't seem to fear the police in any meaningful way, right? But when we worked with student organizers, high school aged organizers in East LA, they automatically, immediately were like, oh, no way. You're going to track my phone now. The police will ask for that data, or immigration will ask for that data. So there are some, I think, populations that have a heightened sense of what bad things might happen, or because they have been happening, right? And so I think there are some lines there that might be worth looking into. But yeah, I think trying to visualize what the eventual harms of this data are and understand them all, we probably need some blend of researchers and users and, all of the above.
Talking about how you can combine different data sets and do interesting things. There was a big story that broke this morning about the Romney campaign doing that to identify potential large donors. And they've been doing this really advanced analytics in secret behind the stage, aggregating the social media.
Right. Fundraising is actually one of the places where this has been happening for a long time. So I worked at fundraising first, and we did the opposite of what I'm talking about now, which was all the surveillance we possibly could, because you want to know where donors are giving and if they give to organizations like yours. And so I mean, I think we have seen elements of this for a long time, and that it's maybe the scope of it now that seems scary, or that you're all kinds of data, not just your financial records, but could also be crossed with your preferences for music and also your health data, right? So there are all these cross possibilities. And that's where there's a really nice privacy and context lit that tries to deal with how do we separate some of these streams back out. It's a hard problem.
wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of accepting that things happen and then taking a route of education. So I don't want to sound like too cynical, but like the forgetting one is really difficult. And I think, Mark mentioned this the other day about Facebook saying that, yeah, they can delete things or whatever, but once something gets posted online, it becomes very permanent, right? Whether the organization you're interacting with archives it or a third party or something like that, once something gets posted, it becomes very permanent. So is there any thought to say, it still is valuable to talk about it up front and say, what can we do, but to kind of flip that to be more of an education thing. And I've seen a lot of times movements like talking to people in high school saying, hey, you really need to think twice before you post every picture you have on Facebook because it's permanent.
Right. Yeah, I think there's some balance here between building infrastructures that tend towards forgetfulness, perhaps, or that have more of the ability to delete built in. That's something we can do, right? It doesn't exist right now, but it is something we could do if we put our minds to it. And it's something actually Europe is. So right now in Europe there is a very controversial piece of legislation that is would guarantee you a right to forget, and that would be about deleting data. Now, whether or not that could happen, and the technical community is up in arms about this. But it's an interesting thing to think about. But I think you're right that we balance it with literacy and reputation management and sort of the skills that we all do, right? We all do what Jessica was talking about earlier, right? We all present, and so learning to present online is part of this. But yeah, I think technology is much more likely to, it's harder to present online. We are having trouble figuring it out. When you have statements like Eric Schmidt saying, well, you shouldn't be doing that thing, just because we're exposed doesn't mean it was our fault, right? That we should. So I think that we need a little balance.
Could you talk a little bit more about the Sends IRB interface?
Yeah. What do you mean? What specifically would you like to know? Like how they interacted or how they actually did it?
A little bit of both, and sort of to talk about what role does IRB play in these projects.
Oh, such a good question. Okay.
It's in a room with paperwork.
Right. Oh man. So I could do a whole talk on the role of the IRB because I think the IRB can be critical here, as I emphasized. But what I left off for length was the flip side of the IRB, which is when they don't understand, and the damage that does with designers. And so these are folks who had to do IRB for the first time, and were generally receptive to it as much as you can be receptive to adding paperwork to anyone's routine, which, I mean, these folks didn't want to document their code. They really didn't want to fill out IRB paperwork. However, fact of life, you have to do it. So that became the norm in the lab. It became sort of accepted and grumbly, and they got help with it. They had an administrator who would help them, and so it became a sort of naturalized process, which was nice. And about 3/4 of the time that worked really well. The IRB would come back and say, yeah, you maybe need to make the consent form, fit better into, so they were doing paper consent forms for online surveys, and the IRB said, well, it might actually make more sense if you did it all in context, right? And so sometimes they were really great. But occasionally, something would come back like, oh, you can't do this invasive tracking thing because you're not keeping your consent forms in a locked filing cabinet, right? And then that just destroys credibility because the designers say, and I have quotes in my longer talk of designers saying, well, they just don't understand, so why should I have to comply with what they want? Because clearly I am a good ethical decision maker and I know what's going on in the system. I will do a good job myself, right? And so this starts to creep into questions, too, of professional ethics. There has not been a strong tradition, although the NSF is actually working hard on sort of building an ethics education component into computer science. And it's starting to happen, but it hasn't been. It's not like law school and business school and where you have to take the ethics class, library school, actually. And so this kind of sense of professional ethics, that you're not the sole decision maker, but that your field might have some standards that would apply here, is something I think IRBs could encourage or be part of. That said, I think we need a lot more technical representation on IRBs. I would like to see CS folks serving. They're going to love me for this, right? Hey, you should be on the IRB. But I think that dialogue could happen a lot more effectively. And this is just also UCLA's IRB, right? I don't have experience with others. I haven't done this yet here, so it will be interesting to see. But yeah, I spoke to the IRBs have a national conference every year, and so I spoke to folks about this, and trying to beef up this relationship between technical folks and the IRB, because I think we're going to see more and more of these kinds of projects housed in CS departments, and that IRB can be very influential.
Well, I think we should thank our speaker.
Thank you.